Welcome to From the Chalkface from Edupulse.
Hello to everyone out there in podcast listening world, and welcome back to another episode of the Edupulse podcast. My name's Adam Colbeck, and I am your humble host this evening on this podcast, where we're going to be diving into all things English and literacy with our guest, Donal Hale. Donal, it's lovely to see you. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Thank you, Adam. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. Excited to get into this. We were just saying before we came on that you're someone who Chris and I have admired from afar for quite some time. We kind of follow you on social media and read some of the things that you post and some of your writing as well. And so yeah, we're excited to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of English tonight, which is what we're going to be talking about, right?
Great. Yeah, sounds good.
So what we like to kind of do at the start of these is to kind of go right back to the beginning with our guests. So can you just give everybody out there just a little bit of a life story of you? So, where did you start? How did you get to where you are today? Anything else about your life story that you'd like to throw in, and go as far back as you can. Go to your childhood if you want to.
I don't think I'll go back as far as childhood, but I'll start with my accent, I suppose, and where that comes from.
Yeah.
So I grew up in Belfast, and I went to school and university in Belfast as well. But probably around age 16, I made a decision that I wanted to be a teacher. I always knew that I wanted to train in London to become a teacher as well. So as soon as I kind of graduated from my undergrad degree in English, I moved over to London. I went to King's College in London to do my PGCE. And then I lived in London for 6 years and worked in inner city kind of South London schools, which was just amazing, just a phenomenal experience to kind of kickstart my kind of teaching career. And I kind of began at a school there as an NQT, and then got promoted quite quickly, I suppose, which is often the way of London and London schools, particularly at that kind of time as well. This is kind of, I qualified in 2009.
Yeah.
So quite a lot was changing in education at that time as well. But I suppose the kind of biggest change was the kind of burgeoning of kind of like research-led education or evidence-informed education. So I was really lucky, kind of about 2 or 3 years into my career. I was studying for my master's at the time in English and education, and my school offered me a position of a research lead. So I was an action research lead for the school, and I led the whole school CPD program on that, kind of like age 23, 24, which was a bit of a baptism of fire as well, and quite scary. But it kind of just shaped everything I did thereafter, because what was really interesting about that time, this was kind of like about 2012, I suppose. It's where people were talking about educational research, but like in classrooms and like practical strategies and how to implement things. So we just kind of jumped on that really, and I jumped in that and kind of led some projects with the school for that, which was just like a dream job really, just to kind of lead the whole school CPD, but with that lens of research as well. So I did that for a few years, but then my wife, who's from Yorkshire originally, was working in Leeds whilst we lived in London for 3 years. So she commuted from London to Leeds. Yeah, which is a bit insane, really. So she went up on a Wednesday night, stayed with her parents in Hull, and then did an hour commute to her office in Leeds, and then came back and probably got back at about Friday midnight every week. I did that for 3 years. And then we got engaged. We're going to get married. And we decided when we got married, or just before we got married, that we should probably live where she worked and a bit closer to where she worked. So I relocated up north in 2016 after 6 years in London. And then did kind of various bits and bobs, really. So lead practitioner of teaching and learning when I first moved up. And then I shifted after a year or so into subject leadership, so head of English roles.
Good.
And I've done kind of head of English now in 3 different schools since then as well, to kind of get me to where I am now. So yeah, it's kind of it's not been a, I suppose, natural like trajectory of a career, I suppose. I've kind of done bits and bats. And at the moment, my job is Director of Literacy and Learning. So I'm responsible for literacy across the school that I'm currently working in, but also staff CPD. But I also lead the English department as well. And what's quite interesting about that role, I suppose, and probably relevant to tonight, is that I was given a beautiful opportunity in 2022 to join a free school and kind of build a department from scratch. So I was able to join Trinity Academy Leeds. I joined in the second year of the school's opening, so they only had year sevens. And then I joined when they had year eights as well. And essentially, we were able to kind of build upon like what we'd done in the map with our sister schools, but we were also given a bit of a blank slate of like, well, this is your department. What do you want it to be? And where are you going to lead it to by the time we get to our first cohort of year 11s? And that's actually this year. So this is the first time we're going to have GCSE results with our first year 11s as well, which is scary, but also really exciting to kind of see the kind of fruits of the labor
Mm.
come in as well. So yeah, lots of different things, I suppose, but that's what I'm currently doing.
That's really cool. I mean, yeah, there's so much there. You've done an awful lot of things, and I think that it's interesting as well that you've a lot of your sort of relocations and movements have been, some of them have been professional choices, but others have been personal choices as well. And I think that's really interesting actually, because often I think you can get into sort of people sort of see themselves as one or the other, or we certainly get this picture that like you're one or the other. Like you either have your job that fits in around your life, or your life
Yeah.
fits in around your job. But I think certainly is reflecting on my own life. At certain times, my job has been the priority. At other times, I've taken job opportunities driven by personal things. So I think that's a really really good example of you doing something pretty similar there. I think it's a pretty healthy way to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's that balance, isn't it? I mean, yeah, like I've done the same as you, Adam, I suppose, in the sense of sometimes it's been, yeah, like the role or a job or a particular school that I want to be in kind of drove that decision.
Yeah.
But I mean, when I was in London, like for context, I mean, I traveled for an hour and a half every day to get to my school. So I did 3 hours of commuting every day to work at that school for 6 years. And like, I loved it. I wouldn't change anything about my school, like, that I worked in, and I always said that in a way I could have wished to pick it up and move it up north. But equally, in terms of, like, my lifestyle at that point, like, I was living in London, but, when you're traveling for 3 hours every day, you've got a wife who's traveling to Leeds, as well. Like, it wasn't like, we were living in London, but, like, we didn't enjoy any aspect of living in London. Like, it was, "Oh, it's really cool to live in London." I was like, "Yeah, but I don't really experience that." Like,
Yeah.
because I like, was either at work or commuting to work. So it was definitely the right decision. But yeah, I think that's always the thing with career moves. It's always that balance of, you do it for the love of the job or the love of life. And, when they both marry up and you can get both at the same time, that's sort of the sweet spot, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Absolutely. So, I mean, let's talk a little bit about English then. So, I guess like the place to start, like lots of teachers who move into leadership have got really strong subject knowledge, but probably a little bit less clarity around what makes effective departmental leadership and what that actually involves in practice. It's something actually that Chris and I write about in our book, Succeeding as a Deputy Head, and we'll come to your book within the same series later on in the podcast as well. But what do you think are like the key habits, routines, priorities that distinguish the strongest department leads from the rest, and particularly within the context of English? What makes a really, really strong department lead?
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it? Because for any head of department role, but particularly head of English, you sort of just work your way up or are given that position, but there's just no training for it and there's no kind of preparation for it. It's just a bizarre thing with our education system where it's like you're an effective classroom teacher and then you're given a leadership position. And I think this happens with senior leadership as well. I've been a senior leader in my current school as well previously. And you are given a brief for a role and not a lot of training to do it. And it's a lot of on the job learning as you go. And I think with English and leading an English department, where that becomes really tricky is that it's so unwieldy where to begin in any school or context or department. Like, in terms of, particularly if you're new to that post, like what the priority actually is could be anything.
Mm.
And it's really hard to kind of pin that down. I mean, I've always taken the view though with that the priority always has to be curriculum and curriculum design, because I think ultimately, like, that's what you're in the business of delivering. And as a head of department, as a head of English, your job is to establish and lead a really strong curriculum model and then ensure that your team around you enact that and deliver that for impact to your students. But again, I mean, if I think about my career, and I've done obviously like very different things, and I'm very well read in terms of educational research, but a lot of that was kind of self-taught or like through my master's program.
Mm, mm,
Like, no one tells you what an effective English curriculum looks like. And if you look at every school across the country, they all have a different English curriculum. Like, it's not like the science specification where
mm.
it's so prescriptive to the point where, like You can say, I'm going to teach, 4.3.2 in the spec, and it's like a specific aspect of how to define enzyme, and this is how you define it, and this is how you get 1 mark in the mark scheme.
Yeah.
You don't get that in English. And I think in some ways that level of freedom can make it quite scary,
Mm.
because you have to then, as a head of English or a leader of English, make quite big decisions about what that content's going to be, what the kind of substantive knowledge of the subject is that you want to deliver, what you need to prioritize. I think with English, we've always been kind of subject to the kind of like knowledge versus skills debate as well. Like,
Mm.
what is English for? What is the purpose of English? And that's just when you think about curriculum. That doesn't take into account then, well, what's effective subject specific pedagogy, or, how do you best assess in English? And there's so many thorny issues with it. But I think for me, as a starting point within any school and any English department, what you decide to teach in terms of your curriculum as a foundation has to be your starting points, because you have to get that right. I mean, and I think because English by its very nature has so many options and breadth available to it to choose from, then you have to be really strong and really, really, really focused on what it is that your students get as a result of your curriculum, and also what your staff are delivering in a powerful way. So I think that's where I've always begun in the kind of different schools that I've worked in. I've always looked at it from curriculum first. I've always thought, well, okay, what's the content that we're teaching? Because for most of my career, like whether I was a subject leader of English or not, even as an English teacher, I've always been amazed by the fact that, in English, you can just have different models of what a curriculum is. I mean, I've worked in
Mm.
some schools or heard of some schools where they will say things like, well, teachers just choose a text to teach, and then they pick up that book and they teach it, which I just find mad, really, to be honest. I think it's absolutely insane that that like is the model, because
Yeah.
I think what that forgets is that, okay, but what you've not thought about is the student's journey then, from like year 7 to year 8 to year 8 to year 9 to 10 to 11 to 12 to 13. You've not thought about the sequence of knowledge that students need. It's just sort of teachers kind of deciding what they do, kind of having a little bit of fun with it. And that's fine if they wish to do that, but it's not really thinking about the big picture. So where I've always got to get in first with schools and in terms of English departments is, what's the curriculum model from year 7 all the way up to year 13? And I've always tried to work backwards. So I've always looked at, well, okay, what's an effective year 13 student? What skills can they possess, and what knowledge do they need in order to enact those skills? And then work your way backwards and design the curriculum that way. So it is that kind of coherent, cohesive, and well sequenced curriculum.
Mm.
I think with recent offset frameworks, not the current one, but the certainly one before, where there was so much discussion around curriculum, I think we've got better at that. But, I still hear so many stories of English departments, and I work with English departments who will say things like, well, there's no content to English. There's no kind of like knowledge to English that you can teach. It's just skills.
Mm.
And I think where I've always worked really hard with kind of the teams I work with is to show them that, well, no, it's a subject discipline, and therefore there's disciplinary knowledge or substantive knowledge that students need, and they need to build upon it. And I've always kind of tried to kind of model that approach. And I kind of give examples in the book about how to do that. And it's very much just one model. And there's other case studies in the book of how people have done it differently. But I think as a starting point, as any kind of leader, as any kind of, head of English, you need to know what your curriculum intent is. Like, what is your curriculum trying to do? And then build from there. Because my view is then, well, that determines what pedagogy you use to enact that curriculum. That determines what kind of assessment model you need to kind of check and evaluate the kind of impact of your curriculum. But I think if you don't start there, then it's just harder to. And I know lots of people will say, well, you need to get culture right first. But I've always seen it as, well, I establish the culture in my teams by showing them what effective curriculum looks like, and then the culture then follows. I think when you say, "Oh well, we need to just get the culture right first," unless you're going to anchor that on something,
Mm.
it can just fall flat. And culture is absolutely really really vital. And I do a lot of work on kind of like how to build cultures within teams as well. But I think you need to have a kind of like your hat to, you know, have on your head as a leader to say like, this is what we're doing as the priority. And then the culture comes and emanates from that.
Mm.
Culture is the kind of inaction of what you're trying to deliver in terms of like a project as a leader. It's not kind of just like an abstract thing. So yeah, it's definitely kind of a curriculum first approach for me.
Mm. Yeah, and that's really interesting. I think the point around culture is a really interesting one because yeah, culture is almost like the byproduct of everything that you do day to day. When you look at anything you read around culture, and even if you were to take a pretty basic definition of it being something like it is like the way we do things around here, well, it's the way we do things. You've got to do the things And there's something inferred in that, that everybody's got to be doing things in a similar kind of way, in a coherent way, in order for culture to result in that. It's not an
Yeah.
in and of itself, it's something that comes out through the processes, right?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think you need, as I said, you need to have something to anchor that onto as well. So like culture will emanate from different things. So even if it's not curriculum, if it's
Yeah.
like, for example, well, this is our pedagogical approach within this department, then that informs your culture and then the culture feels alive.
Yeah.
But again, without that kind of like baseline and that kind of intent and that kind of, setting your stall out as a leader of like, this is what, as you say, this is what we do here. This is what excellent looks like here.
Mm.
I suppose going back to your question as well, asking about the kind of habits of like those really effective departments. I think consistency is just that. And the thing with consistency is that it's sort of a kind of a negative word in some circles. People are like, oh well, it's like about being robotic or it's about like, doing overly scripted. It's not for me. It's like consistency is that if you as a leader say that this is what we do in this department, it's just making sure that actually happens.
Mm.
Because inconsistency is terrible for all involved. I think it's terrible for the students in charge, under your care, under your charge. I think it's terrible for the staff who are then kind of rudderless as well. And as you as a leader, I think that's what you should always aim to achieve. And the kind of vehicle in which you use to kind of, attain that consistency is up to you. And you'll have different ways and techniques in which you want to do it. But that needs to be the goal. So I think that's why I always use the example of, like I still remember, a colleague said to me that, well, can we not just teach the boy in the striped pajamas to year seven? I said, why? He said, oh, because I just quite like it. I'm like, but that isn't a justifiable reason to put that in our curriculum when we've only got a finite amount of time with our students to prepare them for, exams and outcomes and next steps and also to develop them as like, true literary scholars. So no, you can't do that. And this is where kind of, I think there's the sense of consistency is almost kind of in opposition, I suppose, to kind of like autonomy. And I think people do this. They think of autonomy or like agency as like the number one goal of all teachers. But autonomy, I think, is often a misused term in that sense. Like if you're a head of English, for example, and you're enacting curriculum or a pedagogical approach or an assessment model, you can't allow staff autonomy in like the truest sense of like people can do their own thing. And I also don't think that's what autonomy truly is. Like if you break it down, like auto is the Greek of self, nomos is law, it's like self-law, self-governing law.
Mm.
But if you look at it in that terms, like, so for example, like, a British government will take a decision to kind of enact laws that they think is right for, a liberal civil society. But you don't decide then as an autonomous person within that system, I'm not going to follow that law.
Mm.
Like you have to follow it and you're subject to it. And I think that's the thing with regards to culture that people often get wrong is that people think that, as you say, it's a byproduct of something. But I think what leaders often don't do enough, and head of departments, the head of English certainly don't do enough, is actually explain really clearly and really explicitly what they want to see of their team in every aspect. And I suppose that's why when kind of Bloomsbury approached me about kind of writing about secondary leadership, I was just really keen to kind of create that kind of blueprint of like, it can't cover everything, that book. It certainly can't because there's just too much to cover. But I tried to cover as much as possible about all the different things you need to think about as a head of English, how you enact it, how you build culture, therefore, is the byproduct of that. But it's the thinking and intellectual prep almost as a leader that you need really to kind of like get right in as the foundation. And then the habits and the routines come from that. Because if you know exactly what your intent is and you know what the most effective approach or way to implement a policy or procedure is to achieve that goal. But if you don't set the goal, if you don't set that, then it's sort of impossible.
Mm.
It's a shaky foundation.
Yeah, and I think your point around consistency is an interesting one as well, because I think sometimes we equate consistency to consistency of action and actually like consistency of observable action. So are we all doing the same thing? But I don't think that's what it means really. I think it's around consistency of how we conceptualize teaching or how we conceptualize our subject or and probably also how we think about it and how we talk about it. So the actual
Yeah,
enactment of it, there might be differences in how those things are enacted, but we have consistency in how we conceptualize these things. And because we've got consistency at that level, well, there'll usually be a coherence to the actions that we each take within any given department. What I love about what you've said throughout that, I think, is everything is coming back to teaching and being really closely connected to the core business of schools, which is teaching. And I think often when people move into middle or senior leadership positions, they can feel the pressure to come away from teaching. They obviously do less teaching usually, but there's a pressure to come away from it in terms of what actually fills your headspace. And what you're saying, I think, is that the strongest department leads are the ones that really still stay ultra connected to that core purpose. We were going to talk a bit about the book later on, but let's bring it in now. Like, what is the title of the book? What's the kind of journey of that, and what are the key themes with it?
Yeah, so the title is Leading Secondary English, and it kind of says what it does in the tin. It's a blueprint and a kind of a map of approaches, and I use approaches the plural there really importantly because it's not just my words. We've got 8 fellow colleagues who contributed case studies with their own angle and spin as well on how you do different things. But essentially, it kind of it breaks down into kind of 3 parts really. So part 1 is about building culture. So how you build culture and kind of set that vision as a leader. And I think you're right in what you were saying, Adam, there about like consistency isn't about the actions you take sometimes. It can also be a mindset. It's
Mm,
almost like a way and a conceptualization of an approach. So part 1's very much about that. So how you build cultures and how you establish mental models in order to enact that culture and kind of ensure that you bring people along with you as a department lead with your team. And then the second part of the book kind of breaks down what, as you say, I think is the core business of any head of department, but particularly head of English, which is curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. It's the core business of teaching, but I think that has to kind of have primacy because, like, the reason why most people are head of English is probably because they were a really good English teacher
mm.
in most cases, like, that will be the case in most schools, and I think you need to have other kind of, like, hats to wear as a subject leader of English, like, there is administrative jobs and roles, and there's HR components to it, and line management structures to follow, but I don't think anyone looks at a really effective head of English and thinks, "Oh, well, they're really good at the admin," but
Yeah.
like you need that and it's part of it, but like I don't think I'm gonna go, yeah, like, the greatest head of English I ever worked with, really was good with a spreadsheet. Like,
Yeah.
and you have to be, and you have to do that. It's part of the nature of the role. But I think that's kind of why it's quite a bulky section of the book, really, but it's really important. And there's lots of details and examples of how to kind of do that for
Mm,
me and others. And then the third part is kind of the nuts and bolts of leadership. And it's kind of almost my favorite part, really, of the book in a way, because it's sort of the most boring part. And I mean that in the sense of like, it's the boring stuff. It's things like how to lead department meetings. It's like how you avoid like meetings becoming admin. It's also about as well, um, things like, for example, there's really, really practical examples about like how you make your life easier for your team, like how you can avoid queues at the photocopier, like how you can teach them to, dismiss a class for maximum efficiency of the lesson transition. It's about how you organize booklets or books in a book in a classroom just to make sure that everyone has an easy life. It's all of that.
mm,
And I suppose what I was trying to do with it was just kind of cover from my experience of doing it in 3 different schools, but also speaking to lots of other leaders,
mm,
what are all the main things that people get annoyed about in the role? And kind of what can we do to solve those problems? And also just to have it in one kind of place because I mean, there's great books out there about, like how to teach English or, assessment in English, but there's not really kind of it all together. And the problem with being a head of English is that you have to do all of it. It's not just some of it. Um, but I suppose it does have teaching and learning at its core because I do think that should be your central business. I think it needs to
mm,
be. I think that's what's going to drive improvements in a department, but also maximize outcomes for students as well.
mm. Okay, and I suppose like to push on that then. So we absolutely all believe, I think, that curriculum, teaching, and learning should be forefront of department leads' minds all of the time. But like when they're working within a context that is really, really tough, really challenging, when they've got high workload, particularly in English, I guess as well around marking, when there's exam pressures, when there's like really varied pupil literacy levels as well.
Mm.
How can leaders, and reference the book, feel free if there are tips in there around how to do this, but how can leaders maintain that really high ambition but also keep the curriculum teachable and sustainable by managing these other things that are always within their sphere.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the most difficult part of the job, really, isn't it? I think kind of
Mhm.
any role, but I think particularly where that kind of shines a light as a head of English is that, as you say, low literacy levels is where we're going to feel it the most as a subject area.
Mhm.
Like, obviously, a lot impact all subject areas, but that's a real barrier. And I talk a lot about in the kind of first part of the book about like, yeah, you need to build culture, and you need to have like a behavior first approach, and you need to make sure that everything within the school environment allows you to enact your vision, and that's really important as well. But in terms of that balance of like ambitious curricula and like the kind of breadth versus depth discussion, I think all of that's solvable even in challenging contexts. In my first school, like I was inner city, like, London, we had 60% students in receipt of pupil premium. My current school, very similar figures. I think it's like 62% in receipt of pupil premium. Um, I think you can't lower the ambitions for students who come from more disadvantaged backgrounds because I think, I've witnessed schools whereby they have essentially dumbed down the curriculum because they felt that students couldn't engage with the curriculum and it's not helped their behavior problems. It's like that's never been the vehicle, the lever they've pulled, and they've gone, oh, because we've reduced that kind of ambition in our curriculum, actually our students are now well behaved because it was the curriculum that was causing the problem of poor behavior. Because curriculum doesn't cause the problem of poor behavior. That's school culture. And that's
Mhm.
also kind of like, what happens in terms of like how you manage student expectations. And I think you need to have the highest expectations of students, but yeah, you're always going to be kind of pulled apart by different things. But I think it's why I always go back to kind of curriculum as the foundation of what your priorities should be. If you've got a vision and a really clear vision and a real love for what you're trying to deliver to your students, then what you do from there is you work out how to solve those problems around it to enact that. Because if you feel it and you love it, you will find every solution imaginable to make sure that your curriculum kind of doesn't die on its feet. That's
Mm.
really important. Because I think, for example, I remember when I kind of enacted kind of a lot of changes to a Key Stage 5 curriculum when I was a Key Stage 5 lead in a school up north. Um, I just remember thinking like there wasn't there wasn't the model that I wanted in place. So, for example, I wanted to be a bookletized curriculum. I wanted every topic area to have its own booklet. I wanted all the knowledge to be really made explicit. I wanted to use knowledge organizers. I wanted to make it well sequenced. And there were so many barriers to that, not least of things like, for example, that, staff would say, well, students are going to struggle to remember that, to bring that into school each day. And if they don't bring it into lessons, then the lesson's going to fall down. And I think the problem with that was, and I remember saying this to a member of staff, like, don't focus on why it's going to go wrong
Mm.
because it's going to go wrong then. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm.
Anticipate this going to wrong, preempt why it's going to go wrong and find a solution to that. So, for example, in that case, there's a really simple solution. And this isn't kind of rocket science, but it was, we'll sanction them. If
Mm.
they forget it, keep them after school for an hour and explain to them that they need that because their lesson's been affected and they can't engage in your lesson because this is how you're going to deliver your lessons from now on. And they need to be part of that. And it was just really interesting because I think what that member of staff didn't quite realize is that you can kind of, you know, allow your vision to be met if you're strong with your, view of what needs to happen and ensure that it happens at kind of whatever cost. And there's other factors that as well. I mean, that doesn't run smoothly the first time you do that. So, for example, I remember member of staff followed that advice and did that, and they said, "Oh, well, they didn't come, to, after school to me." I was like, "Well, that's fine. That's where I step in as leader. I will bring them in the next day. And we'll do 2 hours instead. Or I'll bring a parent and carer in and we'll put that meeting in." But what must never fault at this point is that if you're bringing in this booklet to teach it, because that's the best way to teach our curriculum, you cannot let a student dictate because they're forgetful that you can't do that anymore. Like you can't be led by the students in that sense. And I think that's often where schools go wrong. They look at all the reasons why students might not follow something and then they don't think, well, let's just make them do what we need to do. And you have to put the mechanisms in place. I'm not saying that's easy, by the way. I know that sounds really reductive and really simplistic. And I know that's like a challenge. And, God, I've been there and like I've had to kind of like, drag things up from the absolute ground. So I remember, for example, like, we use Sparks Reader at my current school for like a home learning platform. And like we set our stall out that, we want students to complete, their weekly task to 100%. I remember when we first launched that, there was a big risk of, well, what if like 100 students in the year, and there's 240 in total, in the cohort. What if 100 students didn't do the homework? And we said if they didn't do it, there'd be a sanction, 1 hour after school as a sanction for not completing that for the weekly task. I said, okay, yeah, that might happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to book the assembly hall and the drama studio. I'm going to make sure there's at least 100 chairs. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? In fact, I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to make sure we've got a space for 240 because there's always that risk that maybe no one does it. Let's imagine a single student decides to do this home learning task. And what we'll do is we'll staff it, and work out all the contingency plans, all the staffing, so that if that happens, the sanction would be met at all costs. Because what we were saying is we expect them to do it, and therefore you need to make sure it happens. And we were quite lucky. So like I think we got 90%. But we were still then, having to house, I think it was 28 students in a detention. But because I put all the plans in place to allow for that at a much larger scale than 28 students, it was done. And the completion rates go up and up and up because you're holding to account and you have the highest expectations. So I know, and I'm talking about a context there, where it's inner city Leeds, it's, one of the most deprived wards in the country. I think it's the third most deprived ward in the country. Over 60% pupil premium, a huge multilingual cohort. There's real barriers there. Students arrive well below literacy standards. So all those things you're saying in terms of potential barriers. But I think that's where you as a leader need to kind of ensure there are contingencies in place to make sure that when things go wrong, that you plan for that and preempt it and support it. But what you mustn't ever do is dilute that vision and also that system. Like if you're saying that this is what we do here and that's culture, then you have to safeguard that at all costs. And that is hard. That is really, really hard and tough. And, it requires a lot of effort and energy, if I'm honest. I mean, I still remember we launched that as like a homework. I was just like every lineup, like every assembly, like every interaction at the corridor, like would just speak to students about it. I would make sure all the members of the department would say the same thing. I give them a script to follow to say this, to do this. When a student says X, you say Y, just to make sure we kind of maintain that. And you have to do that. And it's a lot of hard work. And, there are challenging contexts out there. But I think if you know what's going to work and you're strong with that vision that it is going to work, then you do problem solve and you do troubleshoot. But I suppose that is what a head of English does, or any head of department or any senior leader or leader of a skill. It's not, oh, well, we can't do it because this might happen. This might happen. Let's make sure it doesn't happen. Or if it does happen, we've got a plan to solve it for a future time and then make sure that we never dilute. And I suppose that's it. It's just never dilute no matter what.
So it's this idea of being persistent, right? And persistent and consistent. So yes, there are all of these other challenges, but you can't allow all of these other challenges to drag you away still from that central purpose. You've got to make sure that you protect the ambition that you've got around your curriculum. I think what's interesting about that as well is it's the way that we view time and workload, because from what you're saying, the idea is that by investing more focus in curriculum and teaching and not allowing the focus to shift away from that until it's absolutely consistent and right, what we're actually doing is saving time further down the line, because doing that will actually prevent a lot of these other problems from happening. We might have to, in the first instance, deal with those issues at the same time, but if we remain persistent with it, then further down the line, those issues won't be there.
Yeah, and I think that's it. And I think like raising the workload point is important with that as well. And again, I do talk about this in the book, kind of like workload savers. But I think again, as a leader, that comes down to what you prioritize in terms of your vision. So like, for example, I operate with a completely booketized curriculum. So in terms of the workload I'm saving for my staff, it's huge. Like they've got essentially planned booklet that we adapt and tweak and modify each year to make sure it's kind of like the best version of that could be. But they're given a fully resourced curriculum so that they can focus on pedagogy, like how to best deliver that, how to do that with the students in front of them. And it's things like that that you can do. And it's also like I see a lot, particularly within the kind of world of English, of things that I just think that people do and take a lot of time that have no impact. So like, and people are going to hate me for this, but like your Inspector Calls display, like has no impact. And it probably took you hours and it looks really pretty and it's really aesthetically pleasing. But like, no, I've never done displays. I mean, I'm very lucky to work in a school now where we don't have displays at all.
Okay.
I lied. We've got one display, which is just for beautiful work at the back of the room, where you select each term, like the best of students' work, and it goes up. No frills. It's just literally a wall with some blank spaces, like a bit of like an empty art gallery.
Uh-huh.
And you just like pop it up. But things like that, like, I mean, when people talk to me about kind of workload and they say, like, "Oh, I'm struggling with my workload," and I see what their classroom looks like, I'm like, "Well, don't do that. Like,
Yeah.
don't do that. You have to prioritize something. Like, that's not going to, like, no high performing skill, no high performing English department has ever said the reason why we got those results, the reason why we got, I don't know, a progressive +1 is because of our displays, ever.
Mm, mm,
And I know some people say, "Oh, well, it's good for like the learning environment, the classroom environment for the students." It really isn't. Like, it really isn't. Like, there's no evidence to support that. It's an intuition, it's a hunch, and,
yeah.
like, for me, that's staff doing that for themselves. And then I also see those same members of staff complain when, like, students don't appreciate it or, like, students, like, damage it or vandalize it. I'm like, "So you're going to all this effort, and not only are they, like, apathetic towards it, but they're actually aggressive towards it, and you've just lost hours there that you could have spent on, like, I don't know, supporting your team to kind of develop a world-class curriculum," and it's things like that. It's also with marking. So, like, I mean, I'm gonna be really honest with you, and people get really annoyed when I say this. Like, I took a decision in the second year of my career, and I'm now 16 years in, that for the most part, for, like, the majority of the time, I'm not going to work evenings and weekends.
Uh,
I just made a decision, like, literally, like, I was an NQT, did my NQ2 year, and that was a first year. And I was really lucky in the school that I worked in that there wasn't ridiculous demands upon me where I had to do that. But what I realized is about that school is that, this was back when we had kind of, the 5 A star to C metric. Um, we got like 93%, you know, in terms of A star to C in our English department.
yeah.
I spent a year whereby I didn't mark a single book.
Wow.
Didn't mark a single book. And we did a bit of a trial. So we did a really interesting thing. And this is sort of what led to kind of my role, kind of terms of research and evidence informed practice. So my head teacher was really interested in kind of like basically cutting down staff workload and only prioritize it. And he stood up in a staff training session and he said, if you're a classroom teacher in this room, there's only two things you need to do. One, teach really good lessons. And two, mark books. But actually, I'm not so sure about that second one. So we'll see.
Okay. Wow.
And then essentially from that, then he spoke to me and I kind of said, really interesting what you said because I I don't think like me marking books and putting written individual comments on books or ticking and flicking to tick a box for a work scrutiny is having any impact on my students' outcomes. So he said, right, okay, well we'll have to trial it and see. So I had 2 year 7 classes that year. And he said, right, with one of your classes, don't mark their books. And with the other, mark their books like you would do, or like our policy says that we do, and we'll compare the difference. Now, this isn't like an RCT in like the most strictest terms. It was very much like an actual research-led project, but there was an element of like a control and like an intervention to see what impact it would have. What was really interesting when we looked at the outcomes of the students, and they were both aligned in terms of like prior attainment. Like there was the same proportion of like pupil premium, same proportion of send, same proportion of BL. So we tried to kind of make it as like stringent as we possibly could, where you can say like one team was, you know, so variable compared to the other that they weren't a fair comparison. And the students where the books I didn't mark did better than the ones that I did mark the books for. Like when we did the end of year assessment, they did better. And when we tried to work out why that might have been, what I realized was because I wasn't marking their books so much, I
Mm,
had more time to plan better lessons for them.
mm,
So my kind of quality first teaching had improved. And because I got it better the first time, I was doing less corrective anyway through my marking procedure. So it kind of balanced out. So then we didn't want to completely get rid of marking books because like there was value in it to a certain extent, but it really shifted our mindset in terms of like what the purpose of marking books was. And then it's when we started thinking about things like whole class feedback. And if you're not in whole class feedback as the English department, you need to.
yeah.
You
Yeah.
need to. If you're still marking individual books and like it's having no impact. And there's a really, really interesting report from the EF, a marked improvement that came out a few years ago. And it just lays out the case really clearly that there is no evidence and no research that can tell you that individualized written comments or extensive written comments in terms of feedback has any impact on outcomes.
Mm,
And there's an orthodoxy within education, like that's what we do, 'cause that's what we've always done.
yeah.
And because I was really lucky early in my career where someone was able to kind of quite bravely say, let's try to break that orthodoxy and see what happens. And like this must have been like 2010, 11, maybe 2012. I can't remember the exact date. And then you saw kind of what happened. Like we were just ahead of the curve. Like then by the time we get to kind of 2016, like whole class feedback is like kind of like, beginning to infiltrate into the mainstream. And now most people probably use it. Like, I know science departments in schools where they don't mark books at all. Like they just don't mark books and they have some of the best outcomes in the country. So
I'm
like,
with you. I'm with you on that. Uh,
yeah, and it's that. And it's just like, I think that's where as a leader though, you need to be really brave. And you need to say to your team, we are prioritizing X, which means we can't do Y. And I suppose this is where people go wrong, and this is what leads to burnout and like the
Mhm.
workload crisis, is that if you don't de-implement, so sometimes what happens is people bring in a new initiative or a policy, but they don't say, this is what we're not going to do instead.
mhm,
Or they just drop something. Like you have to drop it. Like you have to like work out what that's going to be. And, I think what I've always done in my career, and like, I've been really successful in a range of different skills now, like with some incredible outcomes with this approach. I took the view of like, just to kind of circle back, that what I can't get done in the hours that I allowed to get done probably isn't worth doing. And it made me more efficient as well.
mm,
Like, it made me more efficient, like and, like, I'm never a person who misses deadlines. I'm never a person who doesn't, get my marking done, and I get my marking done often before other people. Like, I'm not saying, like, I'm work shy or, like, you do it, but I think if you set that boundary, then it really allows you to think about what is the priority, what needs to be done, what absolutely needs to be done. I kinda said, like, mostly there are the odd times. So, like, for example, like, we've had mock exams recently, and I have 106 exam scripts to mark in 3 weeks. So, yeah, am I working a little bit more than usual as the kind of modus operandi during that period? Yes,
mm,
but that's acceptable because it's a pinch point and it's kind of understandable, but it's balanced with the times where I don't need to do that. But I think sometimes within English as well, because I think people are a slave to marking. I think they think that in some ways, the more they mark, the more they care or something, or, the more impact it's going to have, but it's not necessarily true. And what's really interesting is you often see underperforming schools require staff to do more marking than higher performing schools.
mm,
Like I always think about like Joe Kirby when kind of Michaela first launched, and like where they introduced this idea of like, we're not marking in English the way that people mark in English. And you see the outcomes they achieve. Like it's important to recognize kind of what works, what doesn't. And you as a leader kind of need to kind of give permission to your staff sometimes to that's okay. And model that as well. So like, for example, like if my staff see that like that's my kind of like working pattern, then it allows them to do the same. Because if their leader's doing it, of course they can do it.
mm.
And it's that balance. But yeah, you need to kind of like cut out the fluff. Like if you're spending 3 hours on a Friday doing your inspector calls display, then, to me, that you don't have a workload crisis. Like, you've got too much time. I have no time to do that. I have
Yeah.
no time. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, what are you actually using the time for maximum impact, I suppose, is the key.
Hey, yeah, I'm absolutely with you on that, and I think it comes back to that point around, okay, well, how do you maintain these really high standards of focus on curriculum and teaching? Well, you delete out a lot of the what I would term sludge, and
Yeah,
you got to be brave enough to delete that stuff out. I'm a primary school teacher by trade. In my last primary school, we got rid of all written marking,
yeah,
all year groups. No one did any of it, and actually, well, that was the intention. But it's interesting what you were saying. Some teachers still clung onto it and did it in secret,
yeah,
which is crazy. But it's I'm absolutely with you. I think that we do spend a lot of time thinking that we need to keep doing certain things that we could de-implement, and that de-implementation piece is, I think, central to what you're saying there about how you maintain that focus on highly ambitious curriculum while also not getting to burnout. So when teachers first step into subject leadership, what are the most common pitfalls that you see, English specific or not? And are there particular assumptions that people make about improvement or data or team management that tend to then cause them problems early on?
yeah. I suppose it depends on which context you mean. So, if, for example, you step in as an external person into a school, then the kind of pitfall that I see most often is that you assume that everything is happening is bad. And that you've been brought in to solve everything. And it's rarely the case. And the only way that does happen is if you're working in such an underperforming setting and like you've been briefed by the principal or the head teacher that that is what you've been brought in to do. But more often than not, it's the case of you're brought in to kind of tweak and refine and improve or like look at the marginal gains. And I think what leaders do sometimes when they step in at this for the first time, I know I've done it as well. Like I'm as guilty of anyone of doing this, where you assume, right, I'm sure they've not done anything that I've thought of. Therefore, it mustn't be great, and there's no good practice. I'm going to come in and revolutionize everything, and sometimes it's not about revolution; it can just be about evolution.
Mm.
So I think kind of when you're going to step in from that perspective, I think the best thing you can do is just observe, like sit back and observe and see what the context is of that school, because no two schools are the same. No two departments are the same. So like you may have all these assumptions about like, well, in my school we taught like with this pedagogical approach, therefore I'm just going to bring it into my new school, but it might not fit within that school culture
Mm.
and it might not work as you might think. So what I tend to kind of advise in that situation is have a period of reflection and like do some real kind of evaluation and stress testing of what you see in front of you and work out what the priorities are, which are context specific. Don't bring in what you think the priorities are before you've even seen the skill. Because I think that's people do. People assume that, oh, I'm going to come in and what they'll need is X, therefore I'll do X. And actually what they needed was Y. And you wouldn't have known that until you went into the skill. And the problem is if you've decided kind of doggedly, well, I'm coming into this and this is my first priority, it might not land very well because it's not actually the priority. Like I remember, for example, like in my current school, when I first began to lead on literacy, and when I was looking at head of English at the same time as well, and I remember thinking, there's loads of things I've done before for literacy in previous skills, but I need to know what this school needs specifically, and we designed a literacy strategy specifically for that school. But it took a while. It took me having to look at, I think I looked at 1,000 student books to work out in terms of written literacy what the issue was. And it transpires what the issue was sentence demarcation.
Mm.
And there's no way I would have known that until I looked at all those books. Like, there's no way as an external person coming in, I could have said, right, here's what I think you should do for literacy. Here's the priority. Here's my strategy. Let's do it. I had to look in, had to evaluate, had to assess what was in front of me and work out what does this school need? And then you build from there. I think as a head of English or a head of a department more broadly, you need to work out what the priorities are, but you don't know that until you start. Now, where it's slightly different, I suppose, if you're internal, if you've been promoted, so a promoted post, you probably have a greater sense of what the priorities are
Mm.
for that. That's absolutely fine. But again, where I see kind of the pitfalls of this is that people pre-decide things far too often and they don't use the evidence in front of them to kind of steer them. So, for example, I remember when I was speaking to someone who worked in a different school, a friend rather than a colleague, and they said, oh, I've got my first head of English job. Um, I've looked at their exam data and I've looked at the question level analysis because they've sent it to me, and I've worked out that, in terms of GCSE literature, they really struggle with Shakespeare, and therefore that's going to be my priority. Lots of like staff CPD on how to best teach Shakespeare. I remember thinking, okay, did they give you I said this, did they give you the results for the last 5 years or just last year? Well, just last year, right, after the last 5 years. And then they did. And then it transpired that that was a blip. That was a blip. That year, that cohort did particularly badly in that section of the exam. And there's a multitude of different reasons why they may have done, but there was not a trend in that cohort, in that context, and in that skill that would justify you saying, I'm going into a department who you didn't know and say, you guys can't teach Shakespeare very well. I'm great at it. Do what I do. Because it
Mm.
didn't lend itself to the evidence in front of you. It would have been disastrous. And then actually what they worked out was they had to go into that school in that post and actually find out what the priority was first. And actually, as they got there, it was really interesting because by the time they were 3 weeks into that post, the whole question level analysis of last year's results was just forgotten about. Like,
Yeah.
no one was thinking about it. Like, no one in senior leadership had tracked it or cared or evaluated the impact of it. And actually, what they worked out was the priority was, oh, behavior wasn't good in the department. Staff weren't consistently applying the behavior for learning policy. So
Mm.
they could have spent all their investment and time and energy in trying to solve a problem that didn't truly exist. And I think that's the kind of balance with it. And I think that's the pitfall. I think like education more broadly, we constantly try to find solutions to problems that don't actually exist or did exist temporarily. Is why I've always been baffled by post-exam analysis. Like, it tells you what a previous cohort did, but every cohort's different. Every exam that's going to there follow afterwards could be different. And yes, there are certain things you can glean from it, and absolutely it's a good starting point, like kind of that data set. But I think that's the issue with kind of like what we've come to in education with our culture around data. It's the start of a story. And I'm really data savvy and data literate. I absolutely love data. I absolutely love analyzing it to death. But I always know it's a starting point of a line of inquiry that I need to follow through. But it will never ever tell me exactly what the priority is until I triangulate and I think about other sources of evidence and information in front of me to really work out what it is. But I think when you step up to that, that's always the thing. Every time it's that I'm going to do this. And I'm like, why? Where's the evidence that's driving you to say that you're going to do that? And it's really interesting. So few people give you an answer to that. They go, oh, well, I sort of feel like, and as soon as you say, I feel like, it's gone wrong. It's gone
Yeah.
wrong. It's a hunch. Like, and we do so much about like kind of evidence-informed practice in terms of teaching and learning, but in terms of curriculum leadership, what we don't do enough of is evidence-informed leadership. Like, are you making decisions as a leader based on the evidence in front of you, or is it a hunch? I think because English by its very nature is like a subjective subject and it's so abstract at times that it's hard to kind of like pin it down as a subject discipline, that people almost apply that to leadership. But you don't have to. Like, you can absolutely really drill down to what that is. And like, I can never tell you from school to school what a priority is going to be until I go in. Like, when I go in and work with the schools or speak to the departments, like, it's really interesting the amount of times where I've done a school visit and they say, yeah, we're working on X. And I come in and go, I understand why you're working on X, but that is not your priority.
Mm.
And you change it quite rapidly because until you do Y, you can't do X. So, for, give an example, kind of fill in the gaps there. So, I went into a school where they said, well, we're really working on tackling, kind of writing at a granular level. I went, okay, that's really good. What are you doing for that? And I said, oh, well, we're working on kind of subordinating conjunctions because we think that if students can use subordinating conjunctions, um, that's going to, increase their ability to use a variety of sentence forms, can improve writing outcomes. I go, okay, great. And then I said, can I have a look at some books? And I looked at some books. And what I noticed was that students were using subordinating conjunctions, but no full stops. And look, you'll know from a primary perspective, Adam, that like there's a foundation of writing where you have to master the basics before you build up. There's a reason why, my daughter's in reception, she's not encountered fronted adverbials yet because she's not ready for it.
Yeah.
Be ridiculous. Like you have to, but that was the thing with that school. They let an initiative or a policy or a decision drive something that wasn't the evidence in front of them. It was like students aren't using full stops correctly. And like that was from year 7 to 11. Like it was just across the board. It was so inconsistent. Like surely you're going to solve that problem first. And then you might want to look at comma splicing because that was the next thing I noticed.
Mm.
And then you might want to look at actually, okay, subordinating conjunctions are great, but they can't use coordinating conjunctions. And you probably want to do that first. And it's just that it's like they didn't have the knowledge of like that there's a logic and there's a sequence behind like of the writing process and what you need to do and kind of build up. And I think primary specialists are far better than secondary specialists at that because they know that and they've taught writing from its like early forms to like, but I think with secondary skills, sometimes it's like you just latch on to an idea and go, we'll do that. And yes, I will say that school did have their students use subordinating conjunctions, but it would not impact and improve their writing outcomes
Mm-hmm.
whatsoever. In fact, in some ways, it was going to, I think, damage their outcomes because they weren't getting the basics right. Although I was thinking of, well, actually, 25% of the GCSE for GCSE English language is for technical accuracy. Like your examiners are going to hammer you for the lack of accuracy. They're not, yes, okay, you might get the odd uplift of a mark here and there because they've used a supporting conjunction for a variety of sentence forms, but that isn't the lever to pull for you as a skill. Like you're not looking at what's in front of you. And it's look at what's in front of you, prioritize that, solve that. And look, I always say this to schools who like do literacy initiatives like that. If you've mastered every basics of literacy and you've got time to do that, fantastic, crack on. But until the basics are mastered, and it's same with English leadership, it's like, if I look at year sevens who, for example, don't understand how metaphor works, then teach them that. Teach them that foundation of everything we do in English. Like everything you're going to do, if a student doesn't understand fundamentally that a metaphor is any description of an object or action in a way that's not literally true, and your staff aren't teaching that, and they're not conceptualizing that and applying that, then they're going to struggle with any aspect of literary analysis.
Well, you
They're going to
can
struggle.
struggle with life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the thing. It's, we've got a massive cohort of multilingual learners in our school. And one thing that our multilingual learner curriculum lead always talks about is that staff need to stop speaking in metaphor. Because when you're new to English, for example, like it's amazing how we take for granted that we speak in metaphor. Like I remember, for example, when I was in London for the first time, and again, there was a range of multilingual learners. And I said to a student who was new to country and new to English, can you give me a hand with that? As in, like, can you do me a favor? Can
Yeah.
you help me here? And he literally put his hand up and gave me his hand.
Yeah.
Because why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he? Doesn't understand how metaphorical language works in a language that's not his own. But if you take that further and just even if someone, is a monolingual learner in English, if you don't understand how metaphor works, you can't understand how literature works. Because especially at secondary level, like essentially, teachers always bang on about in English, like, why don't students understand that these characters aren't real, they're constructs and they're a reflection or a microcosm of writers' ideas? Like, because you're not teaching them that.
Well,
You're
that's
not
it.
secure knowledge of that first. And unless you do that and build upon that, then they are going to struggle. Like if you get a year 11 who still doesn't understand how metaphor works, they cannot write well about their GCSE set text. They
Mm,
can't. Because every text that a student, like Jane Eyre isn't real. Like it's
mm,
fiction, but she represents something. She's symbolic of something within a particular society. But if you don't get that as a concept, then you're going to struggle. So
mm,
again, it's about making sure that you are prioritizing those things. But I suppose it always goes back then to curriculum. Is your curriculum actually doing that? Is your pedagogy lending itself to that as well?
mm. You're absolutely right, and it's so often as well. It's we miss opportunities to show students like the prevalence and the importance of these things. So like metaphors are a really important one. I think even in what you've just said there, you use the phrase "take that idea further." Well, that's a metaphor, right? Not
Yeah.
You're not actually taking an idea somewhere further from where it is, right? That's metaphorical, but I don't think many people would probably recognize that as a metaphor, but actually you're right. Like we lean on metaphor and analogy so much in our language that if we just understood that a little bit better, I think we probably recognize it better and get better at using it as well. In
It's why
terms
an article. Go ahead, Adam.
No, go.
I was going to say, it's why in English departments, more specifically, like how you define metaphor is really important as
Uh-huh.
well. Like, so I give the kind of definition that I used earlier. So a metaphor is any description of an object or action in a way that's not literally true. And you can just play it back to what you said. Well, take that idea further is a metaphor because you're not literally taking the idea further.
Mm.
And if you ask any teacher in my department what the definition of the metaphor is, they will say that word for word.
Yeah.
And if you ask any student in my school, they will say it word for word.
But
It's in
that's
our knowledge.
consistency, right?
It's consistency, but it's what I mean about curriculum because when I designed the curriculum, I designed the definition of metaphor. It appears in every half term of every unit that I teach, and we use it every single time.
Yeah.
And it just means that by the time students get to year 11, and I'm able to say to them, for example, like in their unseen poetry exam, look, unseen poems tend to contain metaphor. So when you're finding that quotation that you want to use for this, find the metaphor. And they go, oh, so I just need to find something that's not literally true. Yeah.
Mm.
And I go, and again, it's about that. I mean, I was sort of questioning, like, are heads of English kind of, able to kind of say that about their teams? Like, that every member of my staff defines it in this way. Because the reason why that's really important as well, because people say, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. So it does, though, because from the student's journey perspective, if they hear the same definition of year 7 from their
Mm.
class teacher and then they change class teachers in year 8, but hear the same definition, and then they change class teachers in year 9 and hear the same definition, what's consistent there is the learning and
Mm.
the curriculum. And what you're accounting for there is the variability of teaching and changes. Because I think where I'm really jealous of primary schools is that, when you have students like through a journey and you only have them and you build them up, you get better outcomes with them. Like I think in secondary schools, like, I've always been really, really mindful of like, particularly with our more vulnerable learners, that where possible within timetable, I will keep our more vulnerable learners with the same class teacher from year 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11
Yeah.
because there's that gap always that happens in September. It happens anyway because of the summer break, but then when it's like you change to a new teacher, and imagine then like you've had a year 7 teacher who tells you what metaphor means, and then your year teacher says a metaphor is when you say something is something else.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, okay, well, I don't know. And then you get the same teachers who complain in year 11. Why don't they understand what metaphor is? Like, honestly, like if you spoke to any year 11, and I mean any of the 240 that we've got in our school and said define metaphor, they would all say the exact same thing word for word, the exact
Mm.
same thing. Because what we're trying to do there with the curriculum is that it prioritizes the students' learning and their journey. It's not like staff it's making sure it's deliberate. It's not making sure staff say things and also embed misconceptions. Like, for example, we had from one of our feeder primary schools, and this is not me bashing primary schools by any means, but
Yeah.
um, students in year 7 say, assembly is where you use like graz,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And it happens, I get it, it's a misconception. And I was going, okay, so I like football. Is that assembly? And they go, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's not though. Let me tell you what assembly actually is. It's comparing two things using like graz. And we take it further, we talk about like tenor and vehicle, we make it more complex as they get older with that and how that works in terms of vehicle choice and that comparison of like or as. But again, without that consistency, again, which comes from your curriculum, your decision as leader, then you're not serving your students very well.
Yeah, and you've come back again there to kind of where we started with this, which is, this point around consistency, and it's consistency of how we understand in this example the definition of a metaphor. It's a consistency of how we talk about it, how we think about it. We're not necessarily saying that that means that every teaching activity has got to be exactly the same, but it's the thinking and the understanding that's got to be consistent. I think that's something that's definitely run through everything you've talked about. Is this idea of being consistent as a leader, but also making sure that you've got a consistent approach across your department as well. Making sure that you don't jump to judgment as that the pitfall that you recognised as well, and being consistent in that as well. It can be really tempting when you think but it's about being consistent in, let's just hold back a minute and make sure I've definitely got the evidence before I make this judgment. So I think that idea of consistency has run through everything that you've said, and I just think this has been a really really enjoyable conversation for me to have had on this cold wet Tuesday evening down south. I hope it's sunnier for you up north.
It's never sunny up north. It's never sunny up north. It's cold, it's wet, it's miserable. But I'm from Belfast, so it's always worse there.
Yeah.
Always. It's rained every day since Christmas in Belfast.
Whoa, yeah. I mean,
Literally every day. I think
that's
there's
quite
one day last week where there was a break from it, but literally every day. So I'm used to it.
Donald, where can people get your book? If and I'm sure they do want it, so where can they get it?
Yeah, so it's available kind of any good bookstore, kind of it's on Amazon, also on the Bloomsbury website as well, for that. So Leading Secondary English. It does have a subtitle to it as well, but just type in Leading Secondary English really, and you'll find it. And yeah, do check it out. And follow me online and ask any questions you want to ask. But thank you so much, Adam, for tonight. Really appreciate it. It's lovely to chat.
Yeah, no, honestly, Donald, it's been fantastic to have had you on, and we really appreciate you making the time to come and talk to us. And I'm sure everybody out there in podcast world would have really enjoyed listening along tonight as well. So thanks so much, and to everybody out there listening, thank you as well for listening along to this episode of the EduPulse podcast. We will be back again next week with another guest diving into something else to do with this wonderful world of education that we all collectively inhabit. Until then, have a lovely week, and we'll see you soon.